There is a certain cold in the British archive rooms. Not the kind that comes from a draft sneaking under the door, but the kind that sits quietly between the pages of a budget speech, a central bank memo, a prime minister's correspondence. You open a file, and the chill rises. It is the chill of decisions dressed as prudence, of arithmetic that bleeds. We return to the spring of 1925. A Chancellor of the Exchequer stands at the dispatch box. Winston Churchill, a man famed for courage in war, now faced with a different battlefield. He announces that Britain will return to gold at the pre-war parity, $4.86 to the pound. It is a sentence as calm as a weather report. It is also a sentence that will tighten like a tourniquet on the country's pulse. Behind Churchill, the quiet council of the old lady of Threadneedle Street. The Bank of England, with its Governor Montague Norman, long fascinated by the gravity of gold, the discipline of convertibility, the Victorian creed that sound money is a nation's spine. In the room and in the air are older voices too. The Cunliffe Committee had spoken after the Great War, recommending a quick return to gold at the old rate, a return to what felt like home. But you can never really go home. Not after 4 years of war finance. Not after the inflation that lifted prices like a tide and the debt that rolled in behind it. Prices did not stroll back down the hill simply because a minister quoted an exchange rate. Costs had moved, wages had moved, the world had moved. Fix the pound at the old gleaming number, and you do not fix reality. You force reality to conform, and reality resists. The pound at that pre-war parity was overvalued. You could hear it in the shipyards on the Clyde, in the pits of South Wales, in the mills of Lancashire. British goods priced in that proud pound were suddenly dear. Steel, coal, textiles, ships. The buyer overseas looked at the price and chose elsewhere. Meanwhile, imports grew cheap. The shop windows filled with foreign goods, and the domestic factory counted the days until the ledger bled from red into darker red. A hard peg has its commandments. If you promise to pay an ounce of gold for a certain quantity of paper, you must make that paper scarce enough and dear enough to keep the promise credible. In practice, that means you lift interest rates and keep them aloft. You welcome deflation into your living room and offer it the good chair. You tell wages to fall because prices must fall. You tell credit to tighten because the anchor must bite. You tell the patient to hold still while you lower the temperature of the room. There is a word economists use for this: internal devaluation. You cannot move the exchange rate, so you move the people instead. You move their wages down, you move their jobs out. You move their towns into the column of depressed areas that the newspapers will one day capitalize like a proper noun. You move hope into the attic and lock the door. In 1925, John Maynard Keynes wrote a slender book with a sharp title, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. He argued that the return to gold at the old parity would strangle trade and employment. It was not the shine of gold he opposed, it was the arithmetic. He put numbers to the intuition felt by any coal hewer who watched orders shrink while the bank spoke of virtue. He did not win the day. Arithmetic, when it suits the powerful, has a way of choosing its own profit. The pound returned to gold. The bank rate tightened. Credit became a cold river that did not irrigate the fields. The great exporting industries of the North and of Wales weakened as if someone had quietly turned off the air. Companies cut costs, then cut wages, then cut shifts, then closed. Men stood in queues that lengthened through rain and hard wind. When you fix a currency above its honest value, you import unemployment. It is a cruel exchange. The price of honor is paid in dinners not eaten. The coal industry became the stage where this policy chose to reveal its face. Mines had long been a delicate equation of seams, wages, and world prices. Now, with the high pound forcing British coal to compete with cheaper foreign supplies, the margin thinned to a paper cut. Owners demanded longer hours and lower pay. Miners answered that a life has costs too. The government tried to delay the explosion. On a July afternoon in 1925, a subsidy was offered to hold the line for a time. It became known as Red Friday. The clock was bought, not stopped. An inquiry followed, the Samuel Commission, full of measured sentences and recommendations that would not square the circle. Lower wages were urged, reorganization was discussed. The subsidy expired. The nerves of the nation frayed. The press smelled tinder. The spark landed in May of 1926. For 9 days, Britain held its breath. The general strike called by the Trades Union Congress began as a show of solidarity with the miners and became the largest industrial confrontation in British history. Trains stood silent. Printing presses idled. Trams stalled on wet rails. The government organized volunteers to move bread and coal. The unions tested their strength and found it met by a state that would not bend. The strike ended. The miners held out through a long season and then faced the arithmetic they had feared. Wages fell. Towns dimmed. The ledger won. Behind it all, the fixed promise. $4.86 to the pound, a number blessed in a London chamber but enforced in every kitchen north of the Midlands. The defense of gold required the defensive bank rate. When confidence in sterling wobbled, rates rose. When gold flowed out of Threadneedle Street, credit was squeezed until the outflow slowed. Each time, 1,000 workshops felt the hand tighten. There is a particular cruelty to deflation. Prices falling can look like relief, but debts do not fall with them. If you owe the bank £100 and your wage falls, the debt grows heavier on your shoulder. Businesses that borrow to modernize, when policy encouraged investment, find their revenues shrinking while their obligations stand tall. Households discover that thrift, once praised, now means cutting warmth and meat. Deflation is hunger dressed as stability. In the city, the defenders of parity spoke of confidence. Sound money would attract capital, they said. It would lower long-term rates, they promised. It would anchor the nation's credibility. And perhaps in the Strand and Mayfair, those arguments rang true over port and good glass. But in the valleys of South Wales and the yards by the Tyne, credibility bought no dinner. Long-term rates meant very little to a man told to take shorter hours for thinner pay. By 1929, the world faltered. The American market turned, and with it, the great currents of credit that had made Europe's post-war reconstruction possible began to ebb. In 1931, a banking crisis in Central Europe sent fear down every corridor where money slept. Sterling came under attack. Gold reserves fell. The Bank of England defended the peg with the only weapons it had: higher rates and tight money. The patient grew colder. There comes a point where arithmetic meets psychology, and both admit defeat. In September of 1931, after 6 years of stubborn adherence, Britain left the gold standard. The promise was withdrawn. The pound fell. Exporters given release from the iron ring breathed in. Within months, activity in many sectors began to stir. The thermometer moved a degree in the right direction. It is one of the nastier ironies of economic life that a decision that took minutes in Parliament took years to reverse in people's lives. What are we to learn as investors and citizens from that long experiment in virtue that tasted like ash? First, that a currency peg is a policy, not a sacrament. It is a choice to fix a relative price, and every fixed price has a bill. If you cannot adjust the value of your money against other monies, you will be forced to adjust everything else. Wages, employment, profits, taxes, public patience. The ledger must balance somewhere. Second, that overvaluation is a slow violence. An exchange rate set above a nation's competitive reality is a machine that transfers pain from the currency table to the factory floor. You will not see the wound as a headline number, at least not immediately. You will see it as a mill that closes a year earlier than it otherwise would have. As a generation that leaves home to find work across the sea. As a child who grows up with a particular kind of quiet at the dinner table. Third, that monetary choices amplify or relieve structural pressures. British coal was already struggling with geology, with fragmented ownership, with global competition. Returning to gold at the old rate poured cold water on a man already standing in the rain. The policy made a hard problem into a crisis that demanded sacrifices from those least able to give them. Fourth, that central banks are human institutions with philosophies and priors. The Bank of England believed in gold because it had long lived inside a world where gold meant order. That belief sat in the furniture. It lived in the speeches and the lunch conversations. Investors must listen not only to the words of monetary authorities, but to their habits of mind. If an institution worships at a certain altar, it will try to defend that altar longer than you think, and it will ask the congregation to bring their own candles. Fifth, that deflation is not an investor's friend unless you hold cash and no one you love works for a living. Falling prices can lift the real return on money in the bank. They also lift the real burden of debt and push borrowers toward the cliff. If your portfolio is an ecosystem that includes equities and credit, deflation is a frost that kills blossoms before they fruit. A policy mix that invites deflation invites a harvest of defaults. There is another lesson, less technical and more human. Policy lives in institutions, but it dies in households. When Churchill made that announcement in 1925, he was not merely restoring a pre-war number. He was putting a price on a theory of national greatness. He believed Britain's word should be good, and that the old measure of that goodness was a fixed promise in gold. He was not alone. Many sensible men agreed. But the nation they ruled had only recently spent blood to keep other promises. The treasury could balance its books. The families could not. You can hear the consequences in the names that still echo in British labor history. The general strike, the depressed areas. You can see them in photographs of men in flat caps waiting at the shipyard gates, in faded shots of miners at the colliery, in the ledger entries of small firms that did not survive the winter. All of it to preserve a number that flattered a certain memory of power. In the end, the market had the last word. When sterling left gold in 1931, exports recovered more quickly than the defenders of parity had predicted. The bank rate fell. The mortgage market stirred. A cautious housing boom took shape in the South and the Midlands. Not everyone rejoiced. The North and Wales still struggled. Structural wounds do not heal on the timetable of the currency desk. But the choke loosened. The room was allowed to warm. Investors today can be tempted by their own versions of a fixed number that feels like virtue. A target price for oil, a magic multiple for technology stocks, a sacred level for a currency board. Beware that feeling. The world moves. Your task is not to hold the tide back with your hands, but to understand the tide and place your bets where the shoreline will be in the morning. If you trade currencies, study the difference between equilibrium and nostalgia. If you own exporters, ask whether your companies are being priced in a money that tells the truth about their competitiveness. If you own domestic cyclicals, ask whether your central bank's creed will starve them of credit when they need it most. If you hold fixed income, learn to hear the footfall of deflation. It sounds like security until it sounds like silence. There is a portrait that hangs in the mind's gallery when we think of Britain between the wars. A gentleman in a dark suit talks of sound money and national honor. Outside his window, workers pass under a weak Sunday. Both portraits are true. Honor matters, and so does bread. The trick in policy and in investing is to know which truth is owed today. Winston Churchill lived long enough to be remembered as the voice that would not surrender in a later and darker decade. That is a fair memory. But it is also fair to remember 1925, to remember that a strong voice can make a fragile choice, to remember that a crisp sentence in the House of Commons can become a winter that lasts for years. Gold is a metal and a myth. It is weight and symbol. In 1925, Britain chose the symbol at the old weight. The world had changed its measure. The result was a long, disciplined suffering that economists call deflation and families call hunger. 6 years later, the symbol was put back on the shelf. The metal remained in vaults. The people, slowly, began to breathe again. In our time, when a policymaker tells you that a number must be defended at all costs, ask a simple question. Whose costs? When a central bank lifts rates to prove a point, Ask another. What point? When a finance minister quotes a parity with the past, remember this story. Remember $4.86 to the pound. Remember the coal dust, the quiet mills, the 9 days when the country stopped speaking in order to say something no one could ignore. The archive rooms are still cold. The files do not warm with age, but if you look closely, you will see the frost melt just a little on the day Britain left gold. Markets, like people, carry memories. Some shine, some ache. The wise investor keeps both in view and never confuses a myth with a meal.